On the 6th of January 2020, the assault on the US Capitol took place, just as Congress was about to ratify Joe Biden's election victory. But you already know all this. Even if you are one of those people who only watches the news once in a year, you've probably all seen the pictures too. We've all seen them. Pictures, audio, video, and memes. So many memes. What's not clear is whether or not we're all on the same page about exactly what it is that happened. In recent months, it is difficult to know what exactly is true in US politics. We live in an era where reality itself is up for debate, which is good for me as a young, healthy-looking, full head of hair Scottish man with perfect teeth. To give you an idea, according to a YouGov poll, 64% of Republican Party voters are convinced, absolutely convinced, that the 2020 presidential election was a fraud. However, every single court in the land has dismissed the fraud allegations made by the Trump campaign. Perhaps many of you think this is all because the courts are part of that fraud. Others will think that Trump has lost the election. And the same goes for the assault on the Capitol. There are already many theories circulating that people on the far left infiltrated the protests and caused them to become violent. So, the question is, what exactly has happened? What is the whole story? Are there really reasons to think that there has been fraud in the elections? What are the key points to understanding everything that is happening? Today, we are going to answer all those questions. But first, let's look at some history.
Find me those votes.
So, not to brag, but this is something that we told you on VisualPolitik before the elections were held. That the real battle was not going to be at the polls, but in the courts in the days following the elections. And now you're probably thinking, but how did you guys know? Can you predict the future? Are you all in on it? Well, the truth is that it was Donald Trump himself who said it. Take a look at this news clip from July 2020.
Trump refuses to commit to accepting election results, Forbes.
All of this stemmed from the controversy surrounding postal voting. Since the time of the Civil War, people in the United States have been able to vote by mail. In other countries, such as Spain or the UK, there are also mail voting systems. Normally, very few people use this option because voters can easily go to a polling station. But 2020 was not a normal year. With the coronavirus running rampant across the country, many people did not want to leave their homes, and so many of them applied to vote by mail. Most of those people were Democrats. Specifically, those who didn't want to go to the polls were Democrats. And you're probably thinking, why is that? Well, very simply, Trump was against the quarantine and Biden was for it. Biden's entire campaign was focused on fighting the coronavirus. So the Democrats were more afraid than the Republicans of catching or spreading it. Well, in very basic terms, this is the origin of the dispute. But listen up, because predictably for American politics, here is where the story gets complicated.
This is a fraud on the American public.
This is how a whole movement called Stop the Steal came about. Since then, Trump's campaign has exposed more than 60 alleged frauds in battleground states. Lawyers like Rudy Giuliani and Sidney Powell closed ranks with the incumbent president. So, what was the problem? Well, firstly, there's the double talk. That's right. One version is what Trump's lawyers have been saying in public, and quite another is what they've been doing in the courts. For example, if you've been following this controversy through the media, you will have come across statements like this one.
That is unheard of, it's illegal, it's unconstitutional, and we will be bringing an action challenging that.
Specifically, in that speech, Giuliani said that there was a massive fraud in Pennsylvania. According to him, the Republican observers did not even have access to the polling stations. Well, that is what he said in front of the cameras. However, what his lawyer said in front of the judge is different. Think about it. In a court of law, the lawyer speaks under oath. His or her words have legal consequences. So in the media, we have heard about monumental frauds. However, if we go to the documents that have been presented in court, we see a much less spectacular reality. I'll give you just one example. For this example, we're going to have to take a little trip to a place called Bucks County, Pennsylvania. In this case, Trump's lawyers could only claim that 2,175 ballots had been counted that were irregular. But think about that for just one moment. Almost 488,000 people voted in that county. So even if the lawyers were right, we'd be talking about 2,175 ballots out of 488,000. Well, of those 2,175 irregular ballots, the board rejected 918 and accepted the rest, because the only irregularity on those ballots was the date was misspelled. As you can understand, in these cases, the right to vote prevails. If you want more details, you have the original sources linked in the description. But basically, we're talking about something so obvious that even Trump's own lawyers ended up dropping the charges. Listen to this.
Petitioners do not allege, and there is no evidence of, any fraud in connection with the challenge ballots.
In fact, the lack of evidence of fraud is not just something that Democrats talked about. Even many lawyers who have worked with Trump for years have turned their backs on him these past few months.
Another law firm has moved to drop its representation of President Donald Trump's campaign. Late Thursday night, Columbus-based firm Porter, Wright, Morris & Arthur notified that the firm is seeking to pull out of the case.
And the truth is that there are strong reasons not to want to represent Donald Trump. I'll give you another example. The alleged fraud in Maricopa County in Arizona. In this case, attorney Sidney Powell argued that the voting machines were rigged. Yeah, you heard that right. So, what was the problem here? Well, she was unable to present any evidence. So the case has been dismissed. Now, Ms. Powell is facing a defamation suit by the company that manufactures the voting machines.
Dominion Voting sues Sidney Powell for defamation over election conspiracy.
But without a doubt, if there is one state in dispute, it has to be Georgia. In this state, there have been 7 cases of alleged electoral fraud. Remember, we are not just talking about any state here. The governor of Georgia, Brian Kemp, belongs to the Republican Party. Georgia's Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, is also a Republican. And let's not forget Chief Justice Harold Melton of the Georgia Supreme Court, who is also a member of the same party as Donald Trump. In other words, in this case, Trump was playing in friendly territory. However, according to his team, there had been a massive fraud in Georgia. Something on the scale of places like Venezuela. Now, if we examine the cases they have presented, we find a different story again. For example, let's look at the case of Chatham County. In this case, Trump's lawyer said that ballots were accepted that came in after the closing of the polls. And you'll say, how many votes are we talking about here? 1,000? 10,000? Well, again, if you read the case documents, you'll see that there are 51 ballots. 51 ballots. In this case, the judge rejected the lawsuit because, once again, there was no evidence. But take note, even if they had won this case, we'd be talking about a massive fraud of 51 ballots. Other alleged vote theft occurred in the voting machines. But, once again, in the absence of evidence, no court has been able to deliberate on anything at all. Just to give you an idea, the battle for the Georgian votes has reached such a level of absurdity that Trump himself even called Georgia's Secretary of State personally.
So, look, all I want to do is this. I just want to find 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have, because we won the state.
Seems legit, right? In other words, it is impossible to say that there had been any fraud. At least, not with the evidence presented by Trump's lawyers. Nevertheless, Trump has stood by his theory right to the end. And that brings us to the next chapter of this story. On the 6th of January 2020, Congress and the Senate meet to ratify the election results. This is a routine process that occurs every 4 years in the United States. All of the votes were already counted, recounted, and checked. Trump's 60 petitions had already been duly dismissed. However, many Republican senators and members of Congress said they would object to the process. The truth is that no matter how many objections were raised, they did not have a sufficient majority to overturn the process. Basically, that's what we all expected to happen on the morning of January the 6th. However,
It is up to Congress to confront this egregious assault on our democracy. And after this, we're going to walk down, and I'll be there with you. We're going to walk down to the Capitol.
in this video, you can see Trump in Washington encouraging thousands of supporters to demonstrate in the Capitol. By the way, here is another example of his famous double talk, because Trump says he will be there with his supporters. This is a man who doesn't like walking much unless it's around a golf course. But, at least as far as we know, no one saw him on Capitol Hill. Once again, a lot can be said in front of the camera. In the middle of an assault with armed protesters, words can have legal consequences. And yes, we are talking about armed people. People who carried homemade explosives and even handcuffs. The National Guard had to intervene. The Vice President, Mike Pence, and the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, had to take refuge in a safe place. The police had to evacuate all the members of Congress and staff. And, tragically, 5 people died. In other words, we are not talking about a simple protest where acts of vandalism have taken place. It was an attempt to take power through violence. And the most surprising thing of all is that the assailants entered the building knowing that they were committing very serious crimes. And, even so, they took selfies with their faces uncovered. These people really hate wearing masks. And I know what some of you may be thinking. What if all of this was orchestrated by the Democratic Party? What if the violent people who broke into Congress were infiltrators? Well, the truth is that they weren't. And we know this because, to be clear, most of the people who assaulted the US Congress are perfectly identifiable. They weren't wearing masks. In fact, the police have already arrested many of them. For example, we have the famous Jake Angeli, real name Jacob Chansley, or as he preferred to be called, the QAnon Shaman, who stormed Congress with a painted face and wearing a helmet with horns. Just to be clear, I'm all for calling people by their preferred name, but the QAnon Shaman? Thank God 2020 is over. Or there's the case of the gentleman who stole Nancy Pelosi's lectern. Both are ardent followers of Trump. You can see it on their social media accounts and at other protests where they have participated. So far, no leftist infiltrators have been found anywhere in the group. They were all followers of Trump's ideology. And, in fact, Donald Trump himself addressed them hours later to ask them to go home. And he dedicated such beautiful words as these just to them.
But you have to go home now. We have to have peace. We have to have law and order. We have to go home. We love you. You're very special. You've seen what happens.
Meanwhile, many Republican senators who were going to object, that is, who'd been in favour of the fraud theory, changed their minds and voted in favour to ratify the elections.
Senators Loeffler, Lankford drop election objections after Capitol chaos. New York Post.
However, amazingly, Trump still has support in both chambers. 121 congressmen, all Republicans, voted against the result. In the Senate, 12 senators, also Republicans, maintained their objections. Remember that the vote in Congress was happening just as the raiders were arriving. In other words, many congressmen cast their votes without knowing what was in store. However, the Senate vote came right after the assault. That is, all the senators were voting after having seen the chaos in the Capitol. At this point, I'm sure you have a lot of questions. For starters, how could a group of raving lunatics enter one of the most secure buildings in the world? What responsibility does Trump have in all this? We can't answer these questions at this time, but we can tell you what could happen to Donald Trump from now on. We're going to take a look at that right now.
All the ex-president's men.
From a legal standpoint, we still don't know if Donald Trump can be tried for sedition. But from a moral point of view, it is clear that he has a share of responsibility for everything that has happened. He was, after all, the one who encouraged the protesters to go to the Capitol. He was the one who spoke of an attack on democracy. His lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, went so far as to call for a trial by combat, which might seem like a metaphorical expression if it weren't for the fact that so many interpreted it literally. The Speaker of the United States House of Representatives, Democrat Nancy Pelosi, has promised a vote to remove Trump. She achieved a simple majority in Congress, and then a 2/3 majority is needed in the Senate. The consequences of the impeachment are twofold. Winning the vote in Congress was expected. All the Democrats and even some Republicans voted in favour. However, in the Senate, it would be more complicated. Meanwhile, Donald Trump is losing a lot of his support, and that includes right-wing political commentators like Ann Coulter, who are already turning the tables on Trump. And the business world is also taking action against Trump. Deutsche Bank has said it will stop doing business with him. Both Facebook and Twitter have banned his accounts forever. And that's where another debate comes in. On the one hand, Trump has used social media to agitate the masses, and we all know what happened there. On the other hand, many people think that freedom of expression should prevail. And don't just think that it's Trump supporters saying that. Take a look at this.
Angela Merkel calls Trump Twitter ban problematic. The German chancellor said although Twitter was right to add warnings to Trump's posts, the move to permanently suspend his account raises concerns about free speech.
There is a lot to say about this topic, but we will leave that for future videos. So now the question is over to all of you. To what extent do you think Trump is directly responsible for what happened? Do you think there are grounds to judge him for sedition? Is it fair that Twitter suspended his account? And do you think that now, finally, Trump supporters will realise the importance of wearing masks? You can leave your answer in the comments below. In the meantime, don't forget that here on VisualPolitik, we release new videos every week. So subscribe to this channel and click on the little bell so you don't miss any of our updates. If you like this video, please give it a like, and we'll see you next time.
If you want to learn more about politics and world affairs and hear some more of my lovely voice, come check out the Reconsider podcast, where we don't do the thinking for you. Find Reconsider at www.reconsidermedia.com or on Apple or Google Play or your favorite podcatcher.